Hello and welcome to the symposium. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Connor.
Hello.
And we're going to debate two things. The L word and the W word. The L word is liberalism.
Lesbians?
What's the debate about? Okay.
Sorry.
And W is wokeness. So you have done several videos lately.
Yes.
And you had one with Carl.
Yes.
That you did about liberalism and wokeness and how the former gave birth to the latter, allegedly.
I did see a hilarious comment from one of our viewers that said the audio engineering here is miraculous because they couldn't hear you pounding your fists on the walls throughout the discussion.
I saw that as well, and that was a very funny comment. And you also had another video on the live podcast with a guest and Carl that you also asked me to watch. And,
with Ralph Scholhammer. Yes.
And I thought that was an interesting video because it was very brilliantly put. But again, I think I disagree with the overwhelming majority of what was being said. But let us structure the conversation. I think we should talk about liberalism and the comprehensive liberalism side of things, because this is a term that is constantly used on our debates. Then talk a bit about what wokeness is, because I think we have distinct interpretations of the phenomena. I have a very cynical interpretation of it. It seems that you think that a lot of people actually believe that thing.
I'm going to frame it in an interesting way, but yes, I think the conviction is sincere.
Okay, I think that for the key players, wokeness is just a very cynical endeavor, but we'll see about that and then tie the two conversations together. Right?
Yep, absolutely.
So let me just start with saying the following. It seems to me that it is counterproductive to talk about liberalism with a capital L. Because it is very unlikely that a mass movement that has influenced the Western world and the whole world for centuries, and which contains several traditions within it, will just all fall down with a capital L. And there is one word that just describes all sorts of liberalism, as if all strands of the tradition somehow mysteriously converged to wokeness right now.
How early on am I allowed to disagree?
No, just...
Okay, I think the distinction I want to draw, capital L liberalism is like mammals as a group, right? Each mammal has their own distinct properties. A platypus has some properties of a reptile, but it's still a mammal because there are shared properties within all of the subcategories of mammal. So I think capital L liberalism has some properties which liberalism presumes itself to have an exclusive monopoly on, which all the subcategories of liberalism share, even if they disagree on means, but not necessarily ends and values. Does that make sense?
I think it does. And I think it's good that we have had some discussions after our debates, because I think we are understanding much better where each other comes from. So I think that still it is a mistake to put together all versions of liberalism as if they all share a mysterious essence and they lead to one thing. Because one of the major things in politics, and I see you did a video with Josh on the dark triad personalities being attracted to politics, there is a huge gap between action and rhetoric. And to a very large extent, rhetoric in politics is propaganda. And propaganda directly wants to use symbols and manipulate symbols, because symbols have power in people's minds, in order to control them and get them do what they want. So my position is that after the Cold War, the ideal of liberty, but which was vague in people's mind, was taken by some people and subverted in order to portray liberty in a light that is diametrically opposed to what the overwhelming majority of people within the tradition would allow. So I would just say it's skin suiting. It's people who pretend to be in favor of liberty, but who actually are not. They are manipulating a symbol.
Right. Okay. So there's a lot in that. Firstly, yes, dark triad types are attracted to politics. That doesn't mean that every single person in politics is motivated by personal enrichment and empowerment, and not at all an ideological gain. I think that's one of the distinctions that we're going to make and likely disagree on, if not completely, but where the proportion of motivation lies. As for it starting post-Cold War, I think post-Cold War it gained momentum.
I didn't say it started. I think that it's one of the major milestones, because we have constantly mentioned about Marxists who did the same thing, and they talked about a new kind of freedom. I'm just trying to start somewhere in time in order to talk about wokeness.
Sure. So the runaway success of wokeness is definitely a product of the ideological material conditions of the end of history. It's definitely a product because there is a complacency that set in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, when everyone thought that by living in the end of history, we just had to, as you hear with the American conservatives that are suddenly baffled about how radical the Democrats are, right? We were just negotiating tax policy, but we fundamentally agreed on the direction of the nation, right? We had essentially marginalized to the private sphere all conceptions of the good. And it was just a debate about how to enact a shared conception of the good, even though they didn't really realize that people didn't share the conception of the good, right? So I agree that wokeness gained momentum from the 1990s, but I think that the seed that has germinated within the liberal project was planted long before that. And also, we might disagree on who it was necessarily planted by. I agree with you about the 90s because if you just read the writings of the critical race theorists, as you have, Carl has, Kimberly Crenshaw and her fellow legal scholars were overt Marxists who said that the liberal civil rights project, dubious how liberal it was, in the 60s it did not bring the promise of freedom and equality to fruition enough, therefore we need a new angle of attack. And so we applied Marxism to race. So obviously, yes, it was a subversion by Marxists that took on a new aspect after the Cold War. But I think there are unique vulnerabilities and values of liberalism which mean that it has a project running parallel to Marxism and has before the 90s that allow it to be subverted in this way. Does that make sense?
Okay, I think it makes sense. I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm willing to examine it. And I think it's an interesting thing to talk about. So one thing I want to immediately say is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were a number of people who were market triumphalists, in the sense that they just said that now the free market is going to count for everything and all sorts of problems are going to be solved by the free market. And they took that to ridiculous extents. Now, this kind of thinking doesn't reflect my kind of thinking at all. I think that's unbelievably bad. It's from naive to stupid. And I'm trying to be kind here. So you had people who were trying to say that the market will give a solution to any kind of problem, be it economic or not. That's completely mistaken. So I think that it is right to protest against this because it is obviously wrong and it is obviously harmful, because there have been people who have, especially from the side called communitarian, like Alasdair MacIntyre and Michael Sandel, who have made very good criticisms of this. And they say that, for instance, outsourcing to the market, for instance, wedding gifts, stuff like that, deprives an element of friendship and caring that existed before, but if we just outsource to the market, it's going to be lost. I think they're correct in this. So I think that this kind of market triumphalism is mistaken, and it should be shunned, and it should be rejected. And it has led to very bad and pernicious doctrines that were axiomatic. Like, for instance, you just increase the number of people in a geographic region, GDP goes up. If GDP goes up, then no other problem exists. This should be destroyed, not just rejected. But I would hesitate to say that this kind of, this kind of mentality expresses the whole tradition, at least from Locke up to the fall of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So there is a substantial amount of the tradition that wanted to marketize everything for different reasons. But if you look a bit further back, that was not the only consideration that existed.
Okay, so
do we settle this, that the kind of market triumphalism post Cold War is to be rejected and and is stupid?
To be rejected, yes, but it does have continuity with Locke.
Okay,
I think so. So for anyone who wants to learn more about the market triumphalism thing, look up Buckley's concept of fusionism. I'm sure you're familiar of where the reason it took on so much power is because you had different groups that were shunted into the conservative broad tent. They were the foreign policy hawks who hated the Soviet Union. They were the libertarian Austrian economists who believed that the market will solve all problems and that economics is a social science that can explain man's rational action as like Homo economicus. And then there was a third contingent. It was more like the cultural nationalists that believed in American supremacy. So those were the three pillars. And that is currently fracturing with the MAGA Republicans versus the establishment Cold War Republicans. Anyway, so yes, absolutely agree that the market will solve all problems, materialistic, mechanistic logic is incorrect. I think the problem you have is that those seeds are germinated within the scientific and moral enlightenment. And I think the two figures actually are Locke and Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon with the New Atlantis and Novum Organum. At the end of New Atlantis, he, a bit like Thomas More, describes, for the benefit of the audience, this hypothetical utopia where they are Christians, they've existed since the 1st century, and so they practice a form of Christian science. And right at the end of the list of all these incredible feats of scientific inquiry that are possible in the House of Solomon, which is the Institute of Science there, he says that we have a house of illusion, which allows all forms of trickery to take place, all forms of manipulation. But even though we can do it, we don't do it because we value honesty. And so Christianity was the only bulwark stopping the scientific ambition to go from understanding the world to mastering it and manipulating it. The problem you had there is when Bacon sets out the handbook for the scientific method, people start thinking, okay, well, scientific method and the mythology of Christianity contradict at points, and so the mythology of Christianity must be incorrect, therefore we can withdraw Christianity, therefore there's no moral limits on science, just as there are no moral limits on the market, and so even though science is meant to solve every problem, there's no morality in science, so it's just deconstructing barriers rather than building anything nice. And then with Locke, as you said with the GDP thing, the pernicious myth of the blank slate was an aspect of liberalism at the time. It was an aspect of Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, to an extent. Hobbes had a different interpretation from Rousseau and Locke about the state of nature, obviously, but they all believed in blank slate. Now, that was beneficial, actually. I will defend the blank slate a little bit in its necessity, because it led to the conception of childhood. Because before, children weren't considered, they were swaddled, they were beaten. Then came in England, particularly, a revolutionized consciousness about the need to educate children, to take care of them, to mold them into good citizens. So the blank slate is not completely useless, but it is wrong. And even though we seem to have rejected it, like Steven Pinker's literally written a book called The Blank Slate, even Steven Pinker acts as if you just redistribute enough material resources and bring some foreigner to here that with enough education and with enough housing and food and that, they'll be magically transformed into someone productive. People act as if the blank slate is true. So I think, to condense all that down, the scientific and moral enlightenment revolutions do have a continuity with that suicidal market will solve all problems logic that we saw coming out of the 1990s. I do think there's some connective tissue there.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.